and welcome to Downtime Activities, and welcome to our video format without a name. A short discussion video where we talk about something that's D&D or RPG or storytelling related that we can talk about for a while, but not quite long enough to make it part of our bonus action podcast.
It's the discussions we were having already.
Yes.
Just with a little bit of focus behind it.
Yeah, we just kind of narrow in on something somewhat and turn the camera on. And today we're talking about something that I think is near and dear to a lot of players' hearts. Mm-hmm. At least these are two incredibly popular classes.
Right.
That we, I think, here feel don't get as much flavor as they could because people avoid the big part of that.
Well, and it's funny because this discussion only came up quite recently for you and me. It's something that seems quite obvious to us now that we're sort of sitting down to discuss it, but it's something that we hadn't really given all that much thought to up until now, and I think a lot of other D&D players are probably in the same boat, and it's kind of a shame.
It is. And what we are talking about today would be oaths as well as like patrons. Essentially, if you're a warlock, a paladin, something along those lines, the thing that you get your power from.
Your warlock pact and your paladin oath. Mm-hmm. And I think it's time that those become sort of actual concrete things a little bit. Mm-hmm. That they actually kind of become contracts. Because both of them are supposed to have stipulations for what happens if you don't fulfill your end of the bargain. And that's kind of what they're supposed to be, is bargains. And really, for me, it was playing Baldur's Gate 3 and a couple of throwaway dialogues with Will and his patron, the warlock character that can be recruited in Act 1, that made me kind of realize that, like, this game's doing this right because they've made his pact with his patron an actual contract. It has clauses, it has stipulations for failure.
It has the ability to be interpreted by the person who wrote it in a way that forces acts the person
or to be interpreted by the person fulfilling the pact in ways that, where it's kind of a letter of the law, not the spirit type of discussion. And that's very interesting. It makes the character extremely complex. It makes the relationship between those two very complex. And I think what tends to happen, at least the way we've always kind of run both oaths and pacts in Dungeons & Dragons for the most part, is it's just the class you choose. You just kind of decide who your patron is. Mm-hmm. And it's just part of your build. It's just your suite of abilities. And that's kind of the end of it. Whereas, like, it should have more nuance to it. Being an Oathbreaker Paladin shouldn't just be, oh, I've decided that I want to play an Oathbreaker Paladin. It should actually, be your character making the decision, sort of consciously or unconsciously, to break one of those tenets and break part of that oath. Or if you don't want to be an Oathbreaker Paladin, it requires you to ride that line of trying to accomplish your goals while still adhering to the tenets of your order. Mm-hmm.
An important thing that I'd want to throw out here is that this should be, especially in the state of kind of the oath, the Paladin oaths, should be fairly black and white to the player, and it shouldn't be something where the player's playing the game and all of a sudden you're like, hey, change to an Oathbreaker, that you did the wrong thing.
Right.
I think that it's not very fun to take away player agency.
Absolutely.
And force changes to a character that feel like it's kind of the rug being pulled out from under them. But if at character creation discussion is made and a list of tenets, not necessarily the ones that are written out in the in the PHB or whatever for the class, like, you decide what the tenets are for that paladin character, and then in play call them on it and be like, this is questionable with your oath, just something to consider if you're going to do this.
And if the tenets are black and white enough, the players will probably recognize those moments anyway of, like, I really want to kill this guy, but if I kill this guy, I think killing this guy is the right thing to do, but if I do it by the tenets of my order, I think it makes me an Oathbreaker. Mm-hmm. And then forcing the player to sort of make that decision for themselves. And I totally agree. Don't go off of the ones in the book. Mm-hmm. Like, let them play whatever paladin oath they want to get the abilities that they want, but come up with your own list of tenets for the order that they're a part of.
Absolutely.
And
And
it
let them
builds
be
out the
heavily a
world.
part of it. Let them be heavily a part of building those.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because then that's the whole point, is they're still playing the character they want to play. They wanted to play this paladin who is an Oath of Ancients paladin, but maybe doesn't give a hoot about nature.
Right.
Maybe this is an oath of like ancient knowledge, and they're from some
Right.
order that protects ancient texts and doesn't want the wrong people getting a hold of them. Now they can take that Oath of Ancients paladin and choose a list of things that are like, evil can never get a hold of priceless knowledge. Knowledge should be cherished and protected. Those kinds of things as their tenets. And then it'll be pretty unlikely that their character is going to go in opposition of their tenets, because it's the tenets that they built their character around. But if there's a moment where they need to, they'll be knowledgeable about that, understanding of that, and be like, my character thinks it's worth it in this moment. There's a chance I'm an Oathbreaker. We're going for it.
And
I don't care.
It's entirely possible to do kind of a strike system, especially when it in kind of both of these cases, to make it this, kind of, okay, you can pull off a couple of minor infractions. You're going to get warned. You're going to get a slap on the wrist, but you're not going to become an Oathbreaker unless you make, one really big decision or enough rebellious decisions to trigger that to happen. And that, once again, just gives the players a little bit of leeway and allows them to sort of, still force those very in-character decisions, but with the consequences being lessened a little bit. But with the consequences also still being clear-cut.
And I think that it opens up, in the case of paladins, it opens up the chance for them to make that decision, to break their oath, and then you to have an entire quest line that is their pilgrimage of redemption to gain their oath back. And then that's just, they may have different or not have access to the full suite of their abilities for a short amount of time, but then that's a quest line built into that character's story that they get to complete to kind of come back into the right with their oath. I think we're kind of leaning heavily on the oath here. A lot of these things still apply for the patrons. I think the difference is, for most of the paladin oaths, even some of the more evil ones, or ones that could be seen as a less morally good one, these rules kind of apply. With the patron pacts, it's very much dependent on the patron.
Yes.
I think that when you're talking about like physically writing out the tenets for an oath, they should be a list that the player can go to. And similarly, if you're a like pact of the devil, you're making a pact with a fiend, that's your patron, then a contract makes a lot of sense. A physical written out contract that the player has to sign makes a lot of sense. But for other ones, it might look a little bit different.
And I still think a kind of contract style thing is a good idea, to sort of have all of that down in writing. Because just lore-wise, the idea with a warlock and their patron is that they're agreeing to gift you these powers, but they want something in return. They have tasks that need to be accomplished. They need agents in the mortal realm for one reason or another. In the case of Will from Baldur's Gate 3, he's being used to hunt essentially devils and demons. That's part of where the contract becomes interesting, because the wording of the contract is very specifically vague as far as what his targets are going to be. And that's why it becomes an issue for that character when he sort of begins to realize that this isn't what he signed up for. And that's, to some degrees, the way the contracts should be. They don't have to be vague. They don't have to be punishing to the players, and the players should agree to them. But they should be actually written out with sort of what the patron is expecting of the warlock, and then the players, to some degrees, have to balance that over the course of play.
I think that almost always it should be something fairly written out as a contract, but the nature of that should be in line with the patron. A fiend might have a very formal contract with lots of hidden exploits kind of intentionally sewed throughout it. Whereas dependent on the nature of a fae that you have made a contract with, it might be much more chaotic, much more unhinged and hard to like. The pitfalls aren't because they're intentionally laced in there. It's because the whole thing's so hard to fully comprehend because of the scattered nature of the writer of it,
right,
that you don't fully understand what you're getting signed up for. At the same time, something like a Raven Queen Warlock, that might be more of a tenant like, might be more paladin like. It
Absolutely.
might be more of like a you have to adhere by these things while acting in my name. I give you these powers, but you can't stand for the sanctity between life and death for that threshold to be crossed. If you see that, you have to correct it. Something along those lines. It's all very dependent on the patron, and I think this is good because it makes the hard one, the one that comes up the most, and I think is the one that we're going to have to talk about here, is Hexblade. Right. And Hexblade is used. It is one of the most popular classes in D&D. It is a very strong class. It's one that people love to take a couple dips, a level or two dip into, so that they can use charisma to attack with their weapons, and then combine that and make this crazy build. But because of the powerful early level nature of it, people dip into it and then they don't think twice about it. They're like, "Oh yeah, my patron's some sword in a cave somewhere. And that's really powerful."
And that's really the issue with how Warlock gets treated across the board, is especially when you're mixing in the sort of eldritch abilities and stuff that you get through Warlock. There's so much customization there, and there's so much possibility for Warlock to mesh really well with almost any class and almost any build, that Warlock is very popular for people to take 2 levels in, take 3 levels in, as just part of a build that gets thrown away. And Hexblade is probably the worst of that.
The one that's the biggest offender of people without thought for the nature of their patron. And I think that that's also, in the defense of players doing that, it is one of the least evocative patrons by default to choose. That's because you think of an archfey, you can think of some like winter lord of an archfey realm, or of a fey realm that's very clear what kind of the nature of that entity is, the kind of dark twisted nature of a fiend, the unfathomless nature of an otherworldly being from beyond the astral sea. I believe
that would just be fathomless nature.
Watch Skygate. But the idea of like your patron being a ancient artifact weapon of some sort or something along those lines is really hard to like determine the nature of. And I think the easiest way to help solve that is to have that kind of discussion at character creation. Choose what this thing really truly is and what the nature of the like artifact level weapons have a conscience of their own. That's why they're able to possess this kind of power that they could grant powers to other people. This isn't your flame tongue longsword that's doing this. This is a weapon that has a will and a mindset of its own. And so you could very easily choose to come up with some sort of like holy avenger glaive that's at the heart of some ancient temple that somehow is the thing kind of granting these powers to people, and it demands that anyone who gains power from interactions with it hunts evil or destroys it kind of illuminates the dark places of the world. Just as much it could be some sort of bone mace that has the remnants that was made from the skull of a dead god in the war before time, and that entity wants nothing. Mace. Yeah, wants no, unless it was a small god, wants nothing more than to sow chaos and destruction. And there's everything in between. I think that the issue is oftentimes it's some powerful sword at the bottom of some cave somewhere, and no one ever puts the time into what is the goal of that sword.
Well, and that should be the point of sort of patrons in general. It's like, what are the patrons' goals? What are they trying to accomplish? Why do they need agents within the mortal realm? Why are they willing to grant them powers in exchange for, in exchange for completing tasks? And that gives it's both of these, both oaths and pacts, give the DM and the players a lot of room to expand out the world, to add more detail, to make things feel more alive, as well as excellent fodder for the DMs who build in side quests, little odd jobs that the characters have to accomplish, or even whole main quests or whole character arcs. As you mentioned earlier, with like a paladin trying to sort of seek redemption. And that's even a great place just for a character a paladin character to start to to start as sort of an oath-broken paladin who's trying to work their way back to redemption, but in the same way with those tenets, the orders of their oath very clearly laid out, so that way you can work into your backstory very clearly what you did to become an Oathbreaker paladin, and sort of that quest for redemption. It just makes a thing that all too often is treated as just sort of a throwaway element of a character build into something much more interesting.
Absolutely. And I think that there's also opportunity for, with the warlock side of things, with the packs, you can have this moment where, if the character is acting in direct opposition of the source of their powers might stop working, or might not work in that instance. And I think there's a lot of the fear with this is we play these games to have fun, right? You don't want to have your player make this character they really enjoy playing. They love mechanically, they love the backstory idea of the character, and then you're like, well, you're not being a good enough paladin. You're not being a good enough warlock, so I'm taking your abilities away. That feels bad. And if it's done in that sort of punitive way, then it will feel bad to the player. However, I think that for a lot of people, especially people who play the game like we play, tend to enjoy the story of the game. Their character losing power because of a decision they made, that they knowingly made, knowing what their contract, knowing what their pact, knowing what their tenets are, is a story opportunity and is an interesting one, and gives their character spotlight in a way that's not them being mechanically powerful. It's them being powerful in story and having a repercussion for that they'll have to adapt to and adjust. And you as the DM have ample opportunity with things like warlock packs. If you have a character who's realizing that their pact is a dark one and what they're doing is wrong, give them an opportunity to get a different pact, whether it's the same mechanically. I think back to the original Dracos campaign I ran.
Right.
We had a character who was essentially in a pact with a great evil lich, and you guys eventually hunted down and killed that lich.
He was not all that helpful during that fight.
A majority of that fight turns out Eldritch Blast doesn't work when you're shooting it at your patron. But near the end of that fight, another entity offered power.
Right.
A new contract was signed, and it ended up being a different pact for this character and changing some mechanical things. But you can have that sort of opportunity for the players too, where it's, if they decide that they want to act in opposition, they don't have to start over at level 0. You can absolutely find ways to make their character still gain back some power, even if there's a kind of interim in between where they're weak or they've lost some of that power. And that can be a really powerful storytelling moment. And if it's a good play group who enjoys the story more than the mechanical crunch exclusively of the game, then I think they'll really enjoy that.
And again, if you're sort of setting up these packs and these oaths correctly, their characters losing their abilities isn't going to just happen without warning. The player's going to see it coming, or the player's going to be warned by their patron or by the god that they serve that it's coming if they continue down a certain path. And it's sort of removing that issue of player agency, because you're making the decision the character's decision and not just the game master's decision. And by building all this stuff yourself, working together as a player and a game master, both sides should be satisfied with the sort of final arrangement, and it should still allow the players to play the characters that they want to play.
You give the player agency by them being involved in the writing of the tenets, in the acceptance of the contract before play ever starts.
Right.
Their agency is there, and their agency shows back up when they realize the choice they're about to make has repercussions. They are making that choice. They signed the contract, and they're the one who's about to break it. They know that fully. You are not saying after they've cast a spell at somebody like, oh, that person was actually a cultist of your lord, so your powers are gone, sucks to suck. That's not the nature of this. Right. Their agency is there the entire time. They were there. Of course they know those rules. They were there when they were written. They know this, and they made that decision later on, so you're not stealing agency from them. Well,
and it just even helps to make the patrons and the god that is a paladin order serves, or the eldritch figure that a paladin order serves. And that's what I find interesting about sort of Paladin Oaths and Warlock Patrons in particular is like they can both be just quite powerful entities or gods that this order or this individual is serving. But it helps to make those actually sort of NPCs and actually sort of like actually naming Warlock Patrons and understanding their nature, because it's intrinsically tied to the type of character that you're playing and, you know, the contract that you've been given. And all too often with Paladin orders in particular, it's like, oh yeah, they're a holy avenger, but nobody at the table could tell you what god that Paladin serves. That Paladin has no idea. The DM probably doesn't even really know. That guy just wanted to play a Paladin. It's much more interesting if you're specifically a like monster hunter Paladin, you know, from an order of paladins that worship Selûne, or you know, that worships Helm, and those contracts based off of those two deities are going to look quite different.
Absolutely.
Because you're dealing with like true like lawful good and chaotic good.
And with paladins, it does. And part of it is that the power is drawn from the tenets, not necessarily similar. In older editions, it was more always a god.
Right.
And so it doesn't have to be a divine deity that a paladin draws their powers from. It can be essentially ideals in the current edition, which is hard to wrap your head around, for me at least. I think making it something physical and interactable with makes it a lot more real and kind of visceral for the player in a way that's valuable in making it.
And you know, and if you're dealing, you know, if you're kind of going that route of giving the players some warning, you know, giving them, you know, 3 strikes, having that sort of more physical entity, I guess, or that more sort of understandable entity that their powers come from, gives the DM a lot more opportunity to have those moments of directly warning, you know, a paladin or a warlock that they're crossing a line or they're about to cross a line, as well as just giving opportunity to give out those side quests, give out those odd jobs, and, you know, give players specific tasks that they're supposed to accomplish, which may well just align with their goals and objectives anyway.
Often will, if they helped write that as part of who their character is.
Right.
I think a good opportunity here too is that, like I said, not all Paladin Oaths serve Helm or serve Selûne or have a deity that they follow, but you can do things like, if their paladin character is a Oath of Devotion paladin who has these tenets of good and justice for the common man, and they're kind of spiraling down a dark path, have the spirit of a fallen member of their order show up and warn them what path they're on. Maybe a spirit of one who fell down a similar path and lost their way, trying to warn them away from what they're doing. The NPC kind of interaction doesn't necessarily have to be this otherworldly, all-powerful being. Right. And similarly, I think oftentimes with Warlock patrons, it's more interesting if they're less massive like a tiefling, or not, excuse me, a demonic deity being a like powerful baron of one of the layers of hell is interesting. So is having Asmodeus be yours. But if you're a second level warlock who is in a pact with Asmodeus, it's very unlikely that he's going to show up and be like, "Yes, my agent, I need you to go do this thing." You don't matter enough. You don't matter enough for that to happen. But if yours is something like, kind of like the example with BG3, like it's a powerful fiend from the hells, but not one that runs their own layer of hell.
Right.
Not this god tier being. It's something powerful enough to grant power, but tangible enough that a 5th level, a 3rd level warlock is an agent of theirs that they would physically interact with.
Well, and you know, it becomes obvious through some like potential later interactions, depending on how some things play out, that character, that patron, also has is also answerable to a higher figure, and is on a short leash with that higher power, and, you know, like, is relying on you to accomplish something so that they don't get in trouble themselves, which is where, like, especially if you're trying to break out of a contract, or, you know, if you're reaching the point where you want out of a particular pact and want to, you know, potentially become a different type of warlock, or, you know, restat a character, is where, you know, interesting wheeling and dealing begins to happen between the, you know, that player character and their patron. It just makes everything much more complex, but in a not in a needlessly complex way, in a way that just adds a lot of interesting nuance and interesting possibility.
It kind of gives you that opportunity, like a like a hermit crab outgrowing their shell and finding a new one. It kind of gives you the opportunity as a particularly maybe conniving fiend pact warlock to make a new pact with the demon lord who is in charge of your previous pact owner, like the kind of the next level up, and it's like, that's my new patron. I'm going above you. I want to speak to a manager. You can go full Karen as a warlock and move up to the next level, kind of getting you're kind of getting just desserts on the one that's been using you as their kind of like, do this task for me, you're below me, and you can kind of get that haha gotcha moment for a more twisted conniving character.
Well, in a beginning, we talk a lot about how like magic in D&D just lets you circumvent the rules, especially higher level casters, and that's very much true in this as well. Like you can really begin to find ways in Warlock packs in particular, using the party's collection of spells and spell scrolls and their various contexts to fulfill elements of your Warlock pact to the letter. And then completely undoing all of the work you just did because your contract didn't say anything about not being allowed to do that. All right, we went and we killed this guy like you asked. The cleric immediately brought him back to life, but we went and killed this guy like you asked.
You said I had to summon this demon into the material realm. You didn't say I couldn't have my guy have a magic circle ready and a banish spell ready so that they'd stay trapped and we'd ship them back when we were done. They were here. They were here for 3 whole rounds.
He was. We summoned him. And he even remained on this mortal plane. He might be stuck in this iron flask now that will never open, but he's here, like you wanted.
Just like you wanted.
And that's where, but you only get that level of interaction, that level of trying to, meet the letter of the law and not the spirit of the law, if your contracts, your pacts, your tenets are actually written out in detail.
And that's just... I think it's just the amount of work up front you put in is how much you'll get out long term.
Absolutely.
And a lot of that will come down to the DM consistently giving opportunity to interact with the patron in very physical or in very kind of distant sort of ways, and for the player to buy in and to be interested enough in the story that it's okay if there's times where they are at a detriment because of it. It'll make for a very interesting story. And I think that that level of buy-in from both people and that consistent use of that will make it really important and impactful and cool in your story.
And it just gives rise for, making the character sort of answerable to something gives rise to, forcing them to be answerable. It's interesting to have, your paladin who decided to break his oath because there was just something he couldn't let go. And, there's this moment where his tenants have gotten in the way of doing what he thinks is right. So he makes the decision to become an oathbreaker. Then, the later on down the road when other members of his order are trying to hunt him down and bring him in alive to answer for what he's done is absolutely fascinating. And we've mentioned a lot that the easiest way to make a world feel alive in any tabletop RPG is consequences, both good and bad. And that puts direct consequences on the player's actions in a sort of worldwide sense. And it's the same thing with Warlock packs. Presumably this isn't the only Warlock of this patron. So them breaking their contract for one reason or another, making them sort of answerable to that, even if it just, makes them now hostile to a faction, is very interesting. And the player character is probably going to... Even the character may not get all that much enjoyment out of it, but the player is probably going to get a lot of enjoyment out of it.
Yeah. It just comes out... As the person running the game, do it in a way that drives story and isn't just punitive. And you will avoid people being offended and hurt.
Don't intentionally make it punitive.
Yeah. If you are intentionally making anything in your game punitive... Either you're a jerk or you're feeling the need to do that because your player is a jerk. Either way, a conversation needs to happen and potentially new groups need to be made. Yeah. Because if punitive actions are necessary at the table, then one of two people is doing it wrong, probably both. So make it story driven, make it fun, and make packs and make oaths matter.
Yes.
And really put the effort into making them matter.
You will see that effort rewarded without a doubt.
Absolutely. From both sides, with story and with cool interactions in the game. I think that's a pretty good place to stop here. We can probably keep going, but if we go too much longer, then we're going to have to turn this into a different video format. So this is probably a good place to stop it there. What is other people's advice on this? What do you, if anyone's played a warlock or a paladin or something along those lines that has that sort of power source, what's a way you've seen it done really well? What's a cool concept you've come up with? Maybe a specific contract idea or a way to do it that's unique and interesting and makes for a really cool story.
Do you just really adhere to the tenets as outlined in the paladin section of the PHB, or do you come up with your own? How? Like, I do really want to hear if other people have been doing this for a while, how much mileage they've got out of it.
As we said, this is something that we've given a lot more thought to recently and plan to employ more going forward. What's some people who've done that for a while, and how's it worked out for you? Thank you all for watching. Do we do our normal outro on these? I feel like it's hit or miss.
Most of the time I think you do, but I don't know.
So this time we will. Anyways, so go forth. Slay dragons, sling spells, roll dice, and enjoy your downtime activities.